Hey everyone, I never thought I'd be writing something like this, but I need to get this off my chest. My name is Mike, and I live in a pretty quiet town with my wife Sarah and our two kids, Emily and Jack. We've always been a normal, happy family. Until recently, that is. It all started about a month ago. I'm a bit of a tech geek and spend a lot of time on my computer. I'm into all sorts of forums and online communities, but I've always stayed away from the dark web. I've heard all the horror stories about it, and I didn't want to get involved with anything shady. But curiosity got the best of me one night, and I decided to explore a bit. I found a few forums that seemed interesting, but nothing too crazy. Then I stumbled upon a site that looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. The design was old and glitchy, and there were a lot of weird symbols and codes. I almost clicked away, but something caught my eye. A thread titled, "Family of 4 Needed for Sacrifice." At first, I thought it was some sick joke. The post described in detail how they were looking for a specific family, a man, woman, and 2 kids, to be sacrificed for some ritual. I should have closed the tab right then and there, but I was morbidly fascinated. I kept reading, and that's when I saw it. They had pictures of my family. Not just random photos either. These were pictures taken from inside our house. There was one of Sarah cooking dinner, one of me watching TV, one of Emily playing in the yard, and one of Jack sleeping in his crib. My blood ran cold. How the hell did they get these? I immediately called Sarah and told her to get the kids and go to her sister's place. She was scared and confused, but she didn't ask too many questions. I called the police next. They came over, took a report, and said they'd look into it, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. They probably thought I was some paranoid freak. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, watching the security cameras I'd hastily set up around the house. Nothing happened. The next few days were quiet, and I started to think maybe it was just some sick prank. But then the letters started showing up. The first one was just a piece of paper with a symbol on it, the same weird symbol I'd seen on the dark website. I threw it away, but they kept coming. Every day, a new letter. Some had cryptic messages, others had more pictures of us, but they were getting more personal, more intimate. They even had pictures of Sarah and me in our bedroom. Someone was watching us. I decided to go back on the dark web and see if I could find out more. I don't know what I was hoping to find. Maybe some clue about who these people were or how to stop them. I went back to the same site and started digging through old threads. I found more references to sacrifices, rituals, and some sort of cult. They called themselves the Watchers. I found one thread that chilled me to the bone. It was a list of rules for members. They talked about stalking families, gaining their trust, and preparing them for the ritual. It was sickening. But what really got me was a list of families they had completed. There were dates, names, and details about what they did to them. The last entry was from just a few days ago and the family's name was crossed out. I couldn't stop thinking about what completed meant. Things got worse. Sarah's sister called me one night, frantic. She said someone had broken into her house and left another letter. This one had a picture of Sarah and the kids at her sister's place. They were everywhere. We couldn't escape them. The police still didn't take it seriously. They said it was probably just a prankster trying to scare us. But I knew better. I could feel them watching us, always one step ahead. I couldn't even trust the police anymore. What if they were in on it too? I didn't know what to do. I was scared out of my mind. Every night, I barricaded the doors and windows, but I knew it wouldn't stop them. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly on edge, waiting for something terrible to happen. Then, one night, I heard a noise outside. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the bed and went to check it out. As I crept through the house, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I got to the living room and saw a shadow move past the window. I froze, my mind racing. Was it them? Were they finally here to take us? I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, clutching the bat, staring at the door, waiting. But they never came. The next morning, I found another letter on the doorstep. This one was different. It was a detailed description of what they were going to do to us. They talked about the ritual, the pain, the fear. They said it was all for some greater purpose, that our suffering would bring them power. I broke down. I couldn't take it anymore. I felt helpless, terrified, and angry. How could these people do this to us? What did we ever do to deserve this? That's where I am now, writing this. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to protect my family. I feel like I'm losing my mind. If anyone has any advice, please, I'm begging you, help us. I don't know how much more we can take. It's been a week since I wrote the first part of this. I didn't think things could get worse, but they have. If you read my last post, you know about the letters and the photos. Since then, the situation has spiraled out of control. It started with Emily's school. We got a call from the principal saying that someone had tried to pick her up, claiming to be a relative. Thankfully, the school has strict policies, and they didn't release her, but the fact that someone tried made my blood run cold. They knew our routines, where our kids went to school, and they were getting bolder. Sarah and I decided to keep the kids home for a few days, but we had to go back to work eventually. We couldn't afford to lose our jobs, especially not with all the extra expenses we were racking up on security measures. We installed more cameras, got an alarm system, and even bought a gun. I've never been a fan of firearms, but desperate times call for desperate measures. One night, while reviewing the camera footage, I saw something that made my skin crawl. There was a figure standing in our backyard, staring up at Emily's bedroom window. It was around 3 a.m., and the figure just stood there, motionless for what felt like hours. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the darkness. I showed the footage to Sarah, and she broke down in tears. We felt so violated, so helpless. The next day, I went to the police again, but it was the same story. They said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. It felt like they were waiting for something terrible to happen before they'd take us seriously. I left the station feeling more frustrated and scared than ever. Then came the phone calls. They started as heavy breathing, just static and occasional whispers, but then they began to speak. The voices were distorted, like they were using some kind of voice changer. They'd say things like, "We're watching you," and "You can't hide." It was pure psychological torture. One night, they called and played a recording of Emily's voice, taken from God knows where, saying, "Daddy, help me." We decided to pack up and leave town. We thought maybe if we disappeared for a while, they'd lose track of us. We didn't tell anyone where we were going, just threw some clothes in a bag and left. We drove for hours, checking into a small, out-of-the-way motel. For the first time in weeks, we felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe we could outrun this nightmare. But they found us. The first sign was a note slipped under our motel door. It had the same symbol, and it simply read, "You can't escape." I wanted to scream. How did they find us so quickly? We decided to move again, this time to an even more remote location. But the fear was always there, lurking. Every car that drove by, every person we saw, felt like a potential threat. Our breaking point came a few nights later. We were at another motel, far from anyone we knew. It was late and the kids were finally asleep. Sarah and I were sitting on the bed, trying to come up with a plan, when we heard a knock at the door. I looked through the peephole and saw nothing but darkness. Then, another knock, louder this time. My heart was pounding as I slowly opened the door, bat in hand. There was no one there. But taped to the door was another picture. This one was of Sarah and me, taken from outside the window of our motel room. I felt my knees go weak. They were here, right outside, watching us. I slammed the door shut, bolted it, and called the police. They came, but by then, whoever had been there was long gone. They took our statement, but I could tell they thought we were overreacting. Sarah and I barely slept that night. We kept the lights on and took turns keeping watch. The kids were restless, sensing our fear. The next morning, we decided to go to the only place we felt might be safe, my parents' cabin in the mountains. It was isolated, off the grid, and I hoped that maybe, just maybe, it would be far enough away to give us some peace. We drove for hours, constantly checking our rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following us. We finally arrived at the cabin, exhausted and on edge. The place was old and a bit run down, but it was secluded. No internet, no cell service, just us and the wilderness. It felt like a temporary sanctuary. For a few days, things were quiet. We started to relax a little, thinking maybe we had finally shaken them off. The kids played outside, and Sarah and I tried to find some semblance of normalcy. But that peace was shattered one night when I found a new letter on the porch. It was the longest one yet, filled with explicit, horrifying details about what they planned to do to us. They described torturing us, making us watch as they hurt our kids, and then using our bodies in their sick rituals. I couldn't take it anymore. I felt like I was losing my mind. How could these people be so relentless, so evil? I started to question everything. Why us? What did we do to deserve this? I couldn't find any answers, only more questions and an overwhelming sense of dread. That night, we heard noises outside the cabin, footsteps, whispers, rustling in the bushes. I grabbed the gun and went outside, my hands shaking. I shouted into the darkness, demanding they show themselves, but there was no response. Just more unsettling silence. We barricaded ourselves inside, terrified and desperate. I don't know how much more we can take. This isn't living. It's pure, unending horror. If anyone out there has any advice, any way to help, please, I'm begging you. We can't keep running. We need to find a way to stop this, before it's too late. After the night at the cabin, we decided to stay put, hoping that isolation would keep us safe. But we were wrong. The first sign of trouble was when we found dead animals around the property. It started with a rabbit, then a raccoon, and finally a deer. Their bodies were mutilated, arranged in grotesque poses, and their eyes had been gouged out. It was a message, a warning. Sarah was on the verge of a breakdown. She kept saying she heard voices at night, whispers coming from the woods. I wanted to believe it was just her imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I heard them too. Low, menacing voices calling our names, promising pain and suffering. The stress was taking its toll on all of us. The kids were scared and confused, and we were running out of ways to comfort them. Then, one night, the unthinkable happened. We woke up to Emily screaming. We ran to her room, and what we saw will haunt me forever. There was a man standing over her bed, dressed in a black robe, his face hidden by a hood. He had a knife in his hand, and he was chanting something in a language I didn't recognize. I lunged at him, but he was fast. He slashed at me, and I felt a searing pain in my arm. Sarah grabbed Emily and ran out of the room, shouting for Jack to follow her. The man disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. I chased him outside, but he vanished into the woods. My arm was bleeding badly, but I didn't care. I had to protect my family. I called the police, but again, they were too late. They took our statements, searched the area, but found nothing. They said they'd increase patrols in the area, but I could tell they didn't believe us. We were living in a nightmare. Every night, we heard noises, footsteps on the porch, tapping on the windows, whispers outside our doors. I barely slept, keeping watch with the gun in my lap. Sarah was a wreck, and the kids were terrified. We felt like prisoners, trapped in our own home by some unseen force. One morning, I woke up to find another letter pinned to the front door with a knife. This one was different. It was written in blood, and it was a direct threat. They said they were coming for us, that we couldn't hide forever. They described in graphic detail what they planned to do: torture, mutilation, and finally, the sacrifice. I knew we couldn't stay at the cabin any longer. We packed up and left, not knowing where we were going, just needing to get away. We ended up in another motel, this time in a small town miles away from the cabin, but the fear followed us. Every car that drove by, every stranger we saw, felt like a threat. We were constantly looking over our shoulders, waiting for the next attack. One night, while I was out getting supplies, Sarah called me, panicked. She said someone had broken into the motel room and left another note. This one had a picture of us, taken from inside the room. They were always one step ahead, always watching. I rushed back, and we decided to keep moving, never staying in one place for more than a night. During one of our restless nights, Sarah confessed something that shook me to my core. She'd been having nightmares about the cult for months before all this started. She described dark, twisted visions of rituals, blood, and sacrifice. She said she never told me because she thought they were just dreams. But now, she was convinced they were more than that. She believed the cult was somehow reaching into her mind, tormenting her from a distance. I didn't know what to think. Was it possible? Could they really have that kind of power? I was starting to lose my grip on reality. I felt like I was slipping into madness, unable to protect my family from this invisible enemy. We decided to reach out to an old friend of mine, Jake, who had some experience with the dark web. He used to be into all sorts of shady stuff before he turned his life around. I hoped he could help us figure out who these people were and how to stop them. We met him in a diner in the middle of nowhere, far from prying eyes. Jake listened to our story with a grim expression. He said he had heard of the Watchers before, but he never thought they were real. According to him, they were a secretive cult that believed in gaining power through the suffering of others. They used the dark web to find their victims, choosing families at random and tormenting them until they could perform their rituals. He said our best bet was to try to track them down online, to find out who was behind the attacks and expose them. It was risky, but we had no other options. Jake agreed to help, setting up a secure connection and diving into the darkest corners of the internet. It was a race against time, a desperate attempt to find answers before it was too late. While Jake worked, we continued to move from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough for them to catch up. But it didn't matter. They always found us. The letters kept coming, the phone calls, the photographs. We were living in constant fear, knowing that at any moment they could strike. One night, while reviewing the footage Jake had found, we stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. It was a video of one of their rituals. They had a family tied up, screaming and begging for mercy. The cult members were chanting, their faces hidden by masks. I watched in horror as they carried out the ritual, ending in the brutal sacrifice of the family. And then I saw it, the next family on their list. Us. I couldn't take it anymore. I felt like I was losing my mind. The fear, the paranoia, the constant terror, it was too much. I knew we had to stop running and face them. Somehow we had to fight back. But how do you fight an enemy that knows your every move, that can reach you no matter where you go? I don't have the answers yet. But I know one thing. We can't keep living like this. We have to find a way to end this nightmare, to protect our children and ourselves. I'll do whatever it takes, even if it means facing the Watchers head on. They've taken everything from us. Our peace, our safety, our sanity. It's time to take it back. After seeing that video, we knew running wasn't an option anymore. We had to face the Watchers head on. But how do you fight an enemy that thrives on fear and shadows? We decided to hunker down in a place they'd least expect, an abandoned factory on the outskirts of an old industrial town. Jake, our only lifeline, suggested it. He said it would be easier to defend, and we could set traps and monitor the perimeter with the few resources we had left. The factory was a grim, desolate place, filled with rusted machinery and broken windows. It smelled of decay and abandonment, but it was our best bet. We set up camp in an old office room, barricading the door and setting up makeshift alarms with cans and wires. Every noise, every creak put us on edge. We took turns keeping watch, knowing that sleep was a luxury we couldn't afford. Jake continued his search on the dark web, trying to find any information that could help us. One night, he found something, a chat room used by members of the Watchers. It was filled with sickening messages about their rituals, their beliefs, and their plans. We learned that they believed in a twisted form of immortality, achieved through the suffering and sacrifice of innocent families. It was a cult, more insidious and powerful than we could have ever imagined. One name kept coming up, the Herald. He seemed to be their leader, the one orchestrating everything. If we could find him, we might have a chance to stop this madness. Jake managed to trace some of the messages back to a location, an old mansion on the outskirts of another town, not far from where we were hiding. It was risky, but we had no other choice. We had to confront the Herald. We made a plan. Jake would stay behind, monitoring the dark web for any signs of movement, while Sarah and I would go to the mansion. I didn't want to take her, but she insisted. We couldn't leave the kids alone, so we took them with us, hoping the factory would remain undiscovered for just a little longer. We arrived at the mansion just before midnight. It was a sprawling, decrepit estate, shrouded in darkness and surrounded by a high iron fence. We crept through a broken gate, our hearts pounding. Every shadow, every rustle in the bushes felt like a threat. We found a side entrance, the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the mansion was worse, a labyrinth of decaying rooms and corridors filled with the stench of mold and rot. As we moved deeper into the mansion, we heard faint chanting. It was coming from the basement. My heart was in my throat as we descended the stairs, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and we could see a dim light flickering at the end of a long hallway. We reached the basement, and what we saw will haunt me forever. The room was filled with hooded figures, their faces obscured by masks. They were gathered around an altar, chanting in that same eerie language. And there, at the center of it all, was the Herald. He was an imposing figure, his mask more elaborate and terrifying than the others. He held a knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light. The Herald saw us before we could react. He raised his hand, and the chanting stopped. The room fell into a deafening silence. He spoke, his voice deep and resonant, filled with malice. "Welcome, Mike. We've been expecting you." My blood ran cold. How did they know we were coming? Before I could think, the herald gestured to his followers and they moved towards us. We were outnumbered and outmatched. They grabbed Sarah and the kids, pulling them away from me. I fought back, swinging my bat, but there were too many of them. They overpowered me, holding me down as the herald approached. He leaned in close, his breath hot on my face. "You can't escape your fate, Mike. You and your family will be the ultimate sacrifice. And through your suffering, we will gain power beyond imagination." I struggled, rage and fear coursing through me. But I was helpless. The herald began chanting again, and his followers joined in. I watched in horror as they dragged Sarah and the kids to the altar. The herald raised his knife, ready to begin the ritual. Just when I thought all hope was lost, there was a loud crash. Jake had found us. He burst into the room, a wild look in his eyes, brandishing a crowbar. He swung at the herald, knocking the knife from his hand. Chaos erupted. The cultists turned on Jake, giving me a chance to break free. I grabbed Sarah and the kids, and we fought our way out of the basement, leaving Jake to fend off the cultists. We ran through the mansion, the sounds of fighting and chanting echoing behind us. We burst through the front door and into the night, not stopping until we reached our car. We drove away, not looking back, hearts pounding and minds racing. We didn't stop until we were miles away, far from the mansion and the Watchers. We were alive, but the nightmare was far from over. Jake had sacrificed himself to save us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of the Watchers. We found another motel, and here I am, writing this. I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know if we'll ever be safe, but I do know one thing. We're not going to stop fighting. We're going to find a way to stop the Watchers, to end this nightmare once and for all. After escaping the mansion, we spent a few days in the motel trying to recover. We were exhausted, both physically and mentally. The kids were traumatized. Sarah and I barely spoke, and every little noise made us jump. We were broken, but we knew we couldn't stay hidden forever. We had to find a way to end this. Jake's sacrifice haunted me. I couldn't shake the image of him fighting off those cultists, giving us a chance to escape. I owed it to him to finish what he started. I went through the information he'd gathered before the mansion raid, looking for any clue that could lead us to the Watchers' base of operations, or their leader, the Herald. It was during one of those late-night searches that I found it, a reference to an old, abandoned church in the middle of nowhere. According to the chat logs Jake had found, this place was significant to the Watchers. It was where they conducted their most powerful rituals, and where the Herald held court. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead we had. We packed up and left before dawn, driving for hours through desolate roads and empty landscapes. The church was deep in the woods, isolated from civilization. As we approached, a sense of dread washed over me. The building was ancient, its wooden structure rotting and covered in vines. It looked like something out of a nightmare. We parked a distance away and approached on foot, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The air was thick with tension, and every step felt like it echoed through the forest. We reached the church and found a side entrance, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. I signaled to Sarah and the kids to stay back while I checked inside. The interior was dark and musty, filled with decaying pews and broken stained glass. The main hall was dominated by a large altar, covered in strange symbols and bloodstains. I could hear faint chanting coming from a back room. It was them. I crept closer, my heart pounding, and peered through a crack in the door. The room was filled with robed figures, their hoods pulled low over their faces. The herald stood at the center, his mask even more grotesque than I remembered. He was chanting in that same eerie language, holding a knife aloft. There was another family bound and gagged on the floor, their eyes wide with terror. I knew I had to act fast. I signaled to Sarah, and we moved in together. She had the gun, and I had a crowbar. We burst into the room, and for a moment, the cultists were stunned. Sarah fired a shot into the air, and the chanting stopped. The herald turned to face us, a look of pure hatred in his eyes. "Release them!" I shouted, my voice shaking with anger and fear. The cultists hesitated, looking to the herald for guidance. He sneered, then laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You cannot stop us, Mike. "You and your family will be our greatest sacrifice," he said, taking a step forward. Sarah aimed the gun at him, her hands steady. "Let them go, or I swear I'll shoot," she warned. The herald paused, then signaled to his followers. Reluctantly, they released the bound family, who scrambled to their feet and ran to us. "Go now," I urged them. They didn't need to be told twice. They ran out of the church, disappearing into the forest. The cultists started to close in on us, and I knew we were outnumbered. But we had one advantage: desperation. Sarah fired at the cultists, forcing them to back off. I swung the crowbar at anyone who got too close. We fought our way to the altar, the chaos and noise filling the church. The herald watched, a twisted smile on his face. He wasn't afraid. He was enjoying this. Suddenly, the room was filled with a blinding light. For a moment, I thought it was over, that they had some kind of supernatural power. But then I realized it was Jake. He'd somehow survived and had rigged up a massive spotlight, disorienting the cultists. "Get them out of here!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the church. With renewed hope, we fought our way to the exit. Jake covered us, using the spotlight to keep the cultists at bay. We burst out of the church and ran, the sound of chanting and chaos fading behind us. We made it to the car and drove away as fast as we could, not stopping until we were miles away. Jake caught up with us later, battered but alive. He'd managed to destroy the church's foundation, collapsing it and trapping the watchers inside. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it bought us time. We found another place to hide, this time a remote cabin that Jake knew about. It was stocked with supplies, and we finally felt a semblance of safety. We stayed there for weeks, recovering and planning our next move. We knew the watchers would come for us eventually, but we were ready. Jake taught us how to defend ourselves, how to set traps, and how to survive. We became a team, bound by our shared trauma and determination to end this once and for all. We hacked into the Watchers' network, exposing their secrets and sharing them with the authorities. It wasn't easy, and we faced constant danger, but we were making progress. One night, we received a message from someone claiming to be a former member of the Watchers. They wanted to help us, to bring down the Herald and end the cult. It was risky, but we had no choice. We met them in a secluded location, and they provided us with vital information. The location of the Herald's true base of operations. It was an old estate, deep in the mountains, heavily guarded and fortified. We knew it would be our final stand. We prepared for days, gathering supplies and planning our attack. The kids stayed with a trusted friend, safe from the coming battle. When the night came, we moved in. The estate was a fortress, but we were determined. Jake and I led the charge, using everything we'd learned to infiltrate the compound. The fight was brutal, chaotic, and terrifying. We faced the Watchers head-on, knowing this was our only chance.